Thanks to Haroon and all of SJP for putting this on and for doing this important educational and political work on this campus. So today my talk is going to fall into three parts. In the first part I'm going to talk about why any moral person should care about Palestine and be outraged about the injustices that have happened and are happening to the Palestinians. In the second part I'm going to talk specifically about why Americans should care about it. And in the third part I'm going to talk about what should be done. So why any moral person should care. The first thing to note is that when people talk about Palestine and the injustices in Palestine, they're often met with the reply of, well, why aren't you talking about Tibet? Why aren't you talking about the occupation in Morocco? Why aren't you talking about the tremendous suffering from civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa, right? There's a whole number of issues that are brought up and say you're singling Israel out when there's lots of countries in the world that are doing bad things. And it's true, there's a lot of injustice in the world. But I think it's worth noting that when the only time people talk about, say, Tibet, is when they're replying to a Palestine solidarity activist, there's reason to doubt their motives, right? When the only time the occupation in Morocco comes up, when the only time these people are willing to talk about sub-Saharan Africa is when someone has first talked about what's happening to Palestinians, we should doubt their motives and not take it seriously. And when it comes to other problems in the world, when someone starts working on heart disease, when someone says heart disease is really bad, no one says, well, what about AIDS? The double standard is actually applied to Palestine, even as people say that people hold Israel to a double standard. So that's just something to, I think, keep in mind in these discussions. So in thinking about the injustices that are currently happening in Palestine, the way I've divided it is I'll talk about Gaza first, then the West Bank, and then Palestinians who actually live in Israel itself. I'll leave aside the question of the diaspora and the refugees for now. We can get into that in discussion. So Gaza has suffered 3 wars since 2009. Operation Cast Lead in 2009, Operation Pillar of Cloud, and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. In these, several thousand Gazan civilians have died, about 4,000 in these 6 years, and tens of thousands have been injured, and not to mention untold property destruction, devastation to the economy, all of that kind of thing. In Protective Edge alone, I want to talk about just one operation on one day in Operation Protective Edge that gives something of a flavor of what the Israeli military does to Gaza in these kinds of operations. So Operation Protective Edge began in the summer of 2014, in late July, when Israeli planes and artillery began bombarding the Gaza Strip once more. And July 20th, Israeli ground forces entered. And they entered the town of Shujaiya, which is a small town that is right about here off the outskirts of Gaza City, which is one of the major towns. Shujaiya is a smaller town. It's about 2.5 square miles. And to put that in context, that's about the size of like the central ward of Newark. So Newark without the Weequahic or the North Ward or the Ironbound or any of that. So not a big area. It has about 100,000 residents. And on July 20th, Israeli ground forces entered, expecting that they would meet very little resistance and that they would be able to kind of sweep through the city, pushing out the population and controlling the area very easily. But that didn't end up happening. Instead, Hamas fighters had prepared very well for the Israeli incursion and had a series of tunnels that allowed them to engage the Israelis at very close range, which meant that Israel couldn't bring most of its artillery to bear for fear of hitting their own troops. And so Hamas fighters were engaging Israeli troops from distances of like 15 meters away, from extremely close combat. And they were able to inflict some significant casualties on Israel, not in the sense of significant in terms of proportional to Palestinian casualties, but significant in terms of the PR impact on Israel. Because the entire kind of image of the Israeli army was, we're invincible, we'll sweep through, this will be no problem. And so once the Hamas fighters were able to inflict casualties, including blowing up an armored personnel carrier, one of these extremely large armored vehicles that Israel is invading with, it shocked the Israeli military and changed the entire tenor of the rest of the war. Israel responded with intense artillery bombardment as Israeli troops then retreated. They fired 7,000 artillery shells in 24 hours. So think about the central ward of Newark being hit with 7,000 artillery shells, each of them creating an explosion, right, in 24 hours. A US military officer was interviewed for Al Jazeera, and he said, the only possible reason for doing that is to kill a lot of people in as short a period of time as possible. He said that's the kind of artillery response that that the US military would use to cover, I think he said 2 divisions of troops, so a huge number of troops compared to what Israel was actually using this for. Again, an extremely densely populated urban area. And kill a lot of innocent people is exactly what it did. In 24 hours, 65 Palestinians were killed, mostly civilians. And this pattern of overwhelming force in a very densely populated area is what characterized Israeli actions throughout the entire war. So on August 14th, the Israeli military put out an estimate of kind of the supplies that had used in the course of the war. They estimated they had shot 3 million bullets. That's 1 bullet for every person in the Gaza Strip, with 1 million left over. They had shot 3 million bullets. They had used 3,000 tons of ammunition, and they had used 20,000 artillery shells. All right, and then again, a tiny area, right? So, people say Israel's often the size of New Jersey. In this tiny little area, they shot 20,000 artillery shells. And this time, Hamas and other factions within Gaza fired rockets into Israel. They fired about 3,000 missiles. All of these missiles combined packed an explosive charge that was equivalent to about 20 of Israel's artillery shells, to give you some idea of the proportionality of forces involved here. In total, 2,200 Gazans died, with 10,000 wounded. Now the cumulative results of these assaults on Gaza and of the blockade on Gaza, the borders of Gaza are completely controlled. Israel determines who enters. Egypt controls one border, although these days and for a long time, Egypt basically does what Israel says. The result of all of this has been 43% unemployment in the Gaza Strip. Absolutely crushing levels of unemployment. In the last 2 decades, per capita GDP in Gaza has fallen by 1/3. So the amount of money being made in the Gaza Strip per person has gone down by 33% over the last 2 decades. And just absolutely crushing poverty. Construction output fell by 80% after the last war. So all of these buildings that were destroyed, huge areas of Shujaiya, a number of cities in Gaza, were completely flattened. And after the war, construction output has actually fallen. So these areas aren't being rebuilt. They're just flattened neighborhoods, buildings that are crumbling. Now, residents of Gaza aren't starving right now because of the extensive aid that's in Gaza from the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and also the UN. But they nonetheless lead lives of tremendous hardship. Many residents can't leave. Israel won't grant permission to leave the Gaza Strip for things like coming to school in other countries, getting jobs elsewhere. They're trapped within. They can't get work because there are no jobs, right? 43% unemployment. And they live in a totally devastated area that is not being rebuilt, right? Palestinian children get up every day and walk by a building that they saw bombed a year ago. And that building is still crumbling, not being rebuilt. Psychologists have studied this. The situation of children living in Gaza, and they've estimated that 90% of Gazan children are living with a mild to severe PTSD. Right? So this is the situation in Gaza. It's an enormous open-air prison. The borders are completely controlled by Israel, and Palestinians living within live lives of tremendous hardship. Israel has essentially been punishing Gaza since 2006 when Hamas was elected, and they show no signs of letting up anytime soon. Now the West Bank is in a very different situation, and the West Bank in news discourse in the United States is often treated as the good Palestine. Gaza is the bad Palestine, West Bank is the good Palestine, because the West Bank is currently ruled by Mahmoud Abbas, a member of the Palestinian Authority, which is still abiding by the Camp David, or the Oslo Accords, that were established in the early 90s, which I'll talk about in some more detail later, but has essentially maintained a peace treaty with Israel and has refused to engage in armed struggle against Israel, and has actually cracked down very severely on groups within the West Bank that attempt to pursue armed struggle against Israel. It's often said that by supporters of Israel, that if the Palestinians laid down their arms, there would be no more war. Well, if Israel laid down their arms, there would be no more Israel. Well, the West Bank is a very good example of what has happened when Palestinians have laid down their arms. The Palestinian government in the West Bank has not engaged in an armed struggle and has, again, cracked down extremely harshly on groups that have tried. what has happened is that Palestinians have progressively lost control of the land in the West Bank, been subject to increasing Israeli control, and have seen their prospects for statehood, for control over their own destinies, grow ever more remote. This is what has happened since the Palestinians in the West Bank have laid down their arms. Now, to understand this, you have to go back to the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, and what they did is they established a process where Palestinians would begin to have some measures of control over the occupied territories, right, what are called the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. In 2006, when Hamas came to power, this gets into a lot of history that we can go into in more detailed discussion. Israel tried to foment a coup against Hamas in Gaza. That coup was repulsed, but it had the effect of splitting off Gaza politically from the West Bank. So Gaza and the West Bank are ruled by different Palestinian political groups. In the West Bank, the Oslo Accords are still kind of setting the institutional structure for government in the region, and that structure is one in which there's kind of three levels of control. First, there's Area A, which is entirely under Palestinian administration. Palestinians control both civil administration, so like zoning laws, tax laws, that kind of thing, and they control security, so the police forces are Palestinian, that kind of thing. That's 18% of the entire West Bank. And if you look at a map, Area A is essentially a series of islands that don't connect in Palestine, okay, or in the West Bank. They're clustered around the major urban areas. So, near East Jerusalem, kind of around Hebron, by Ramallah, those areas. That's Area A. And again, those areas are under Palestinian administration completely. Area B is 22% of the total. It's under Palestinian civil authority, but under Israeli military control. So Palestinians can control things like zoning, which is very important because that decides like where new construction can happen, but they don't control the police force. And so when settlers will burn Palestinian farms, attack Palestinian children, all of that kind of thing, the Palestinians as themselves can't actually control their prosecution of these kind of criminal acts. It's up to the Israeli police. And, people in here can probably imagine how zealous the Israeli police are in prosecuting settlers. Not very. Area C, then, is 60% of the total. And Area C is under full Israeli civil and military control. And again, the civil control is particularly important because that means Israel controls what land is zoned for new construction. So when the population grows in a Palestinian village that's in Area C, and people want to build some new homes, want to build new streets for new businesses, that kind of thing, Israel decides whether that's allowed. And most of the time, Israel says no, it's not allowed. And in Area C, Israel is actually actively engaged in pushing Palestinians out, in demolishing homes, in making conditions unlivable for Palestinians in the hope that they'll go elsewhere. And at the same time, this is where the settlement blocks are also really expanding. So just last month, in August alone, Israel demolished 100 homes in Area C in 30 communities, leaving 230 Palestinians homeless. Right, so the Area C, which is the bulk of the West Bank under the Oslo Peace Accords, has been an area in which Israel has increased control, has pushed out Palestinians on a month-by-month basis, trying to make it impossible for Palestinians to live. And the Palestinian villages that still exist in Area C are effectively constricted by the Israeli refusal to allow any kind of new construction. This is what happens when the Palestinians laid down their arms. There's also violence in the West Bank. Israeli violence continues, although not to the extent of the massacres in Gaza. Palestinians, of course, protest against their removal. They try to stop house demolitions. They try to stop soldiers from coming in and arresting people. And Israel responds with violence. So in 2014, 12 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli forces. 47 civilians total were killed, often in these kind of protest actions, trying to stop Israeli soldiers from making life even more unlivable. Currently, 350 Palestinians, most of whom are from the West Bank, are being held in administrative detention, which means they're being held without trial. There are no charges being brought against them. Israel just considers them security risks, and so it can hold them for essentially as long as it wants. without bringing charges. And allegations of torture and administrative detention are rampant. If you go online and read about it, you can read about the kind of torture positions that Israeli soldiers use, that they put Palestinians, including children, into. One of them involves tying people's arms behind their back and then lifting the tie up on a chain, leaving people in that position for hours on end. It's called a stress position. That's Israeli administrative detention, which is, again, practiced extensively throughout the West Bank. Now, in the West Bank, it's true, Palestinians live better lives than in Gaza, but Israel still ultimately controls their lives. The peace process has brought peace for Israel, but has actually deepened the occupation for Palestinians who still live in the West Bank. Again, this is what has happened when Palestinians have laid down their arms. Now, finally, inside Israel. Supporters of Israel often claim that Palestinians in Israel live in the only democratic country in the Middle East. They live better lives than Palestinians in other Arab countries, or even Arab citizens of other Arab countries. And of course, it's true that Israel is a comparatively wealthy country, in no small part due to the amount of aid it receives from the United States, which we'll get into a little bit later. But few defenders of Israel would ever tolerate living as Palestinians living in Israel do, even as they say their lives are so great. The Palestinian citizens of Israel live lives that few supporters of Israel would ever tolerate. So let's look at Israeli democracy in the last elections, which happened in March 2015 and resulted in the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's Likud party won. And he won after declaring in the last days of the campaign that Arabs are, quote, streaming to the polls, and so Jewish voters needed to get out and vote. Now imagine in the United States a politician saying, white voters need to get out and vote because blacks are streaming to the polls, right? That's something you could imagine maybe in 1965, and with some politicians it's maybe too easy to imagine them saying it today. But it's the kind of thing that would be a national scandal if someone said that, and that politician's career would probably be over. In Israel, the politician who said that rules the country. He formed a coalition with the Jewish Home Party, run by Naftali Bennett. And Bennett has said repeatedly he would never give the Palestinians equal rights, which poses something of a problem for defenders of Israel who say, well, Israeli Palestinian citizens have equal rights. Well, he's saying, I'm not going to give them equal rights. Sounds like they don't have equal rights. He also said if he ever met Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, he would order Abbas to make him a cup of coffee. He said the Palestinians have little role to play besides servants to Jewish citizens of Israel. In 2013, when he was Minister of the Economy, he said, I've killed lots of Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with that. This is, again, one of the leading politicians in Israel right now. Another member of Bennett's party, Ayelet Shaked, posted this on Facebook before the election. They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall all be on their heads. Now this also includes the mothers of the martyrs, who send them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raise the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. After the election, she was appointed Minister of Justice. So Palestinian citizens of Israel live in a country where that woman is their Minister of Justice, runs the justice system for them. This is Israeli democracy for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinian citizens also face extensive discrimination in the law. Adalah, the civil rights organization in Israel, has documented 50 laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, including laws that govern the use of land. So a huge amount of land in Israel is owned by the Jewish National Fund, which by law cannot be sold to Palestinians, can only be sold to Jews. Palestinian students in Israeli schools receive about 1/3 the funding that Israeli Jewish students receive. And since the founding of Israel, over 600 new towns have been established by Jewish Israelis that are recognized by the state. Not a single new town founded by Palestinians has been recognized, and there are currently existed before 1948, which are unrecognized today by Israel. Which again means in terms of things like new construction, if Palestinians try to build new houses, Israel will come through and bulldoze them. For things like getting water hooked up, right, electricity, all of these kind of things, these very basic things for making life livable for people are made impossible by the structure of the occupation inside Israel itself. In 2011, a law was passed prohibiting commemoration of the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians in 1948. when hundreds of thousands were made refugees. In Israel, it is illegal to commemorate the Nakba. So the laws itself, the political class in Israel, the ruling political parties are deeply racist and are open about their racism towards Palestinians. The laws themselves discriminate against Palestinians, and yet we're told that Palestinians in Israel's lives are to be celebrated. Palestinian citizens of Israel live lives that are more comfortable than Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. That's true. But they do not lead lives that match the standards of human rights. And they do not lead lives that supporters of Israel would ever choose to lead. And that's the key point. Okay, so that's the situation that Palestinians currently face, Palestinians in Palestine itself at this point. Why should Americans, and that's a situation that I think any person with a moral conscience should be outraged about. That's a situation that's intolerable if we're going to live in a world of human respect and human dignity. Americans, however, have special reason to care because our country is the main backer of Israel on the world stage, and has been for about 50 years now. The U.S. gives Israel $3.7 billion every year in military aid alone, and that number goes up every single year. That's $10.2 million per day given to Israel. By contrast, it gives about $9 billion per year to all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is an area that contains 800 million people and has some of the most dire humanitarian needs in the world. So, I haven't done the math per capita, but in terms of the amount that Israeli citizens receive, who live, by and large, quite comfortable lives, the amount that they receive in aid from the United States compared to citizens of sub-Saharan Africa who need aid more than most people in the world is the disparity is immense. The U.S. is also Israel's bulldog in the United Nations. So if you look at votes around Palestine in the United Nations, it's like 180 to 2. Or 180 to 3, because sometimes the Maldives or the Mauritian Islands are very small island nations that are basically entirely dependent on trade with the United States, sometimes vote with the U.S. The other two votes are the U.S. and Israel. They're the ones that vote against every condemnation of Palestine. And the U.S., since it has a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, is able to block all kinds of UN action that would help the Palestinians. The question here is why? Why does the U.S. do this? Why is the U.S. on the side of injustice so strongly in Palestine? On one level, that's not a hard question. The U.S. is on the side of injustice in a lot of places, in Iraq, throughout the Middle East. But I think there are deeper reasons that are actually connected to the U.S. interests in Iraq for why the United States supports Israel. And to understand this, it's worth going back some ways in Israel's history, all the way back to Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, the movement to establish a Jewish state. And Herzl was very clear about his project, which was to establish a European outpost, an outpost of Europeans in the Middle East that could act as a gateway and as a guard keeper for Europe. When Herzl went from kind of state to state, he went to Germany, he went to England, to Russia, to all the great states of Europe around 1900. And he promised them, if you support Zionist colonization in Palestine, I'll be an ally for you and I'll help you control the region, right? I'll help you keep control over it because you'll have an outpost of loyal allies there. This kind of conception of Israel's role, that the way Zionism would work is to be an adjunct to the great imperial powers, has continued throughout Israel's entire history. So in 1952, Haaretz, the main Israeli newspaper, like the Israeli version of the New York Times, said this, and this was during the crisis in Iran, when the president of Iran, Mossadegh, was nationalizing Anglo-American oil and was not doing what the United States wanted and causing a lot of chaos in the U.S. as people said, well, we can't talk to this guy. What are we going to do? Israel said, don't worry. Haaretz said, strengthening Israel helps the Western powers maintain equilibrium and stability in the Middle East. Israel is to become the watchdog. There is no fear that Israel will undertake any aggressive policy towards the Arab states when this would explicitly contradict the wishes of the U.S. and Britain. But if for any reason the Western powers should sometimes prefer to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighboring states whose discourtesy to the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible. right? So at a time when Britain and the United States especially are panicking about what's happening in Iran, Israel says, don't worry, we have your back in the region. Continue to support us, and we won't take any action you disagree with, and anytime you need to let us off the leash, we'll be ready to go. Now, this relationship didn't set in right away, and for the first couple decades of Israel's existence, it was actually much closer with Britain and France than with the United States. So in 1956, Israel, France, and Britain invade Egypt in an attempt to overthrow Nasser, the nationalist leader of Egypt. And the United States actually puts a stop to it. And they didn't put a stop to it out of humanitarian concern for for the democratic rights of Egyptians or anything like that. They put a stop to it because France and Britain were fading colonial powers in the region who were slowly losing their control, right? Like Palestine had been a British colony before 1948, before Israel was founded. And same with Jordan, Iraq, a number of countries. And so Britain's hold over the region was loosening. And this war represented an attempt by the old colonial powers to keep their foot in the door, right? To maintain control over the region. And America, as the new kid on the block, the new kid in the region, who was saying, this is going to be our playground now, said, no, you put a stop to this right now. And they did. Israel and the other countries withdrew. So the US actually, for the first few decades, wasn't particularly enthused about Israel's actions in the region, particularly because of its close ties to Britain, who the US was jockeying for influence with. All of this changes after 1967. In the 1967 war, Israel massively defeats the Arab armies, Syria and Egypt. It's often portrayed by supporters of Israel as if this were a terrible, unequal battle in which this tiny country were facing against its giant neighbors. But if you read American CIA notes from the period, the guesses in the CIA were not whether Israel would win, it was whether Israel would win in 1 day or 10 days. It turned out to be 7, somewhere right in the middle. But no one in the American state apparatus thought that there was any chance whatsoever that Israel would lose. So that, the narrative of plucky little Israel against the big neighbors hardly holds up. But after Israel showed that it could defeat the Arab nationalist regimes and inflict a real blow on their credibility, a lot of Nasser's credibility as an Arab nationalist leader came from his ability to say, I stood up to Israel. And after Israel humiliated him in the war and crushed Egypt's military, it was a massive blow to Nasser, and it was the beginning of the end of Nasserism. After 1967, U.S. aid for Israel increases exponentially. So in 1967, the U.S. gave $13 million to Israel. By 1972, they were giving $600 million. So after Israel demonstrated its utility, the United States really started paying attention and saying, this is a good investment for us. This is something we want to pay attention to. American politicians were very open that this is what's happening. So Senator Henry Jackson, who was a Democratic senator from Washington, and who was called the senator for Boeing because Boeing was a defense contractor in Washington, and he did his best to make sure Boeing got all the money they could by promoting the military. He said that Israel and Iran, and just remember, Iran at this point was still ruled by the Shah after Mossadegh had been overthrown. So Iran was a U.S. ally at this point. He said, Israel and Iran have served to inhibit and contain those irresponsible and radical elements in certain Arab states, who, were they free to do so, would pose a grave threat indeed to our principal sources of petroleum in the Persian Gulf. So here you have an American politician, a very powerful American politician, closely linked to the military, spelling out exactly why the United States supports Israel. We want to control the oil in the Middle East, and supporting Israel is a very good way to do that. Now, since this time, since the early 70s, when American support for Israel took off, Israel has been a loyal lieutenant to the United States in its effort to maintain a global empire. So in the 1960s and 1970s, when dictatorships, US-backed dictatorships, were established across South America and Latin America, places like Chile, Argentina, regimes of torturers, thousands of people disappeared for resisting the regimes. It was Israel that supplied the guns. It was Israel that trained the torturers. So there are accounts by Jewish leftists from Argentina who are imprisoned in these Argentinian, in the jails in Argentina, where the Argentinian generals who are fascists are writing swastikas on the wall, and it's Israeli aides who are helping them torture, right? It's Israeli advisors who are aiding them in how to break people, how to extract information, all of that kind of thing. So Israel effectively worked as a subcontractor for the US empire. So regimes that the United States was politically unable to support openly, right? Like Somoza's Nicaragua in the 1980s, another US-backed dictatorship of which the the U.S., there was actually a good amount of conflict in Congress about whether it was a good idea to support this regime or not. So that made it hard for the U.S. to direct as much aid as it wanted. Israel supplied 98% of the military arms to the Somoza regime. And today, Israel still plays this role, although I think it has to be said that this role has been complicated by the rise of other regional powers like Turkey and Iran that the U.S. is trying to figure out how to negotiate. And so I think the recent nuclear treaty with Iran represents an attempt by the Obama administration to bring Iran more fully into the American camp. And Israel doesn't want that because Israel wants to be the only big player on the block, the only big player in the region, and they don't want anyone else having access, the kind of access that they do, and the kind of favored status. So that represents how U.S. and Israeli interests can come into conflict, right? Because the U.S. doesn't care who the biggest player in the Middle East is. As long as they're willing to do what the United States says, the U.S. is happy. And so if Iran is willing to play ball, the U.S. is perfectly happy to play ball. And I think that's at the root of a lot of the recent conflicts. But it would be a mistake to see these as like the beginning of the end of the U.S.-Israel special relationship. Because that relationship delivers such benefits, has delivered such benefits historically, we shouldn't expect it to be given up in the face of, I think, what are effectively minor conflicts. This is what one pro-Israel organization in the United States has said about the special relationship. And remember, this is a pro-Israel organization. Israel is indeed America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. If it were not for Israel, thousands of American troops would have to be stationed in the Middle East at the cost of billions of dollars a year. In contrast to the unreliable friendship of the Muslim countries, the friendship and support of Israel are unshakable because they are based on shared values, love of peace and democracy, blah, blah, blah. What a comfort for our country to have a stalwart and completely reliable Israel in its corner, especially at a time in this strategic area, turmoil, upheaval, and revolution are the order of the day. So this was written since the Arab Spring, which again serve as a confirmation of the importance of the watchdog role that Israel plays. So before 2011, Egypt was a reliable American ally, and it was actually one of the biggest recipients of American military aid after Israel. Well, Egypt was ruled by a dictator, Hosni Mubarak, who was overthrown in a popular revolution. Israel isn't going to be overthrown in a popular revolution from within, right? Israeli citizens overwhelmingly support the colonial project, overwhelmingly support the Israeli state, and overwhelmingly support its relationship with the United States. For all the Arab states that the United States counts as allies, there's a possibility that they could be overthrown by democratic movements from within. That's not a possibility for Israel. And that's why the American-Israeli relationship is likely to endure and indeed, I think, deepen in the long term as the wave of revolutions in the Middle East continues and plays out. So I think even though the disputes over Iran have led to tension, the United States, by and large, understands that the only long-term solid basis for protecting its interests in the Middle East comes from supporting Israel. And that means ultimately supporting Israel's colonial project towards the Palestinians as well. So because of this, because of the importance of the American role in supporting Israel, the amount of tax dollars that go to directly providing military hardware for Israel, I think Americans have a special duty to oppose Israel, to stand up for justice for Palestinians. And I think that completely negates the kind of arguments of like, well, why aren't you talking about China? Why aren't you talking about various other places in the world? The United States isn't directly funding those occupations, isn't underwriting them, isn't supporting them in the UN, isn't making excuses for them in its press, right? The special relationship between the United States government and Israel means that I think American activists also have to have a special focus on Israel and on Palestine as a site of injustice. So what can be done? I'm going to start out a little pessimistic here. And I think in assessing what can be done, we have to assess the nature of Israeli colonialism and how it is different from other colonial regimes. So Israel is an apartheid state, right? And defenders of Israel like to say, well, there's all these differences between Israel and apartheid South Africa. And it's true, there are a number of differences. One of the most important differences concerns the relationship of the colonizers to the colonized. So in South Africa, the white minority relied on the black majority for labor. In the diamond mines, and all of the labor in the country was done by black South Africans. If black South Africans were to have disappeared one day in 1980, all of them disappeared, white South Africans woke up one morning and there were no more black South Africans, the white minority would have panicked because they relied on them to do all of the work. The exploitation of black South Africans was what made the South African economy work. The Israeli economy is very different. It doesn't rely overwhelmingly on the exploitation of Palestinians. It's true that exploitation of Palestinians plays a role in the Israeli economy, and Palestinians often do the most dangerous, low-paid labor in Israel. But if the Palestinians were to disappear, the Israelis would wake up and say, great. They wouldn't be upset at all. And what that means is the leverage that the Palestinians have is different from the leverage that the black South Africans had. Black South Africans were able to mount a massive movement of strikes against the apartheid regime that ultimately brought down the apartheid regime. They were able to say to the white South Africans, you depend on us, and because of that, we can disrupt your entire lives. The ability of Palestinians to do that is much more constricted because what the Israelis want ultimately is the Palestinians gone. They don't care where the Palestinians go, they just want to get rid of them. And that means that the South African solution of a massive internal movement of strikes, of protests, of that kind of thing, is not likely to be as effective. That doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. And I think the rise of BDS has shown the potentials that do exist for influencing the Israeli state. And I think BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanction strategy of boycotting Israeli goods, pressuring companies and states to divest from Israeli companies, and ultimately attempting to get sanctions against Israel, just as sanctions were applied to South Africa, represents a real step forward in the Palestinian struggle for freedom. For decades, the Palestinian struggle was led by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, which led the armed struggle against Israel, and was the main leader of the Palestinian struggle. The PLO had a particular strategy that was not oriented towards international solidarity in nearly the same way that the BDS movement was. So the PLO would accept massive amounts of money from various Arab states like Iraq in the 1970s and 1980s. And this essentially allowed people like Saddam Hussein to pose as supporters of the Palestinians. They never actually cared about the Palestinians, but they could say, we've given tens of millions of dollars to the PLO, so we're supporters of the Palestinians. But in return, the PLO would stay silent on what was happening in those countries. For example, so in 1991-92, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, the PLO actually backed Iraq in that, which is a very bad move. It lost the PLO tremendous amount of credibility. And that kind of strategy of saying, we'll accept money from these various regimes for our struggle, and in return, we're not going to kind of comment on what's going on in these countries, and we'll basically support them. And we're not going to try and wage an international struggle against Israel. This whole strategy, ended up in the Oslo Accords. And the breakdown of the Oslo Accords has, I think, is what's given rise to the BDS movement. And the BDS movement has had a totally different outlook. It's been about making links between injustices in other countries and us, about connecting the oppression that Palestinians face to the oppression that people in America face. So right after Ferguson, BDS activists helped point out that the Ferguson Police Department was actually trained in part by Israelis, right? They went to Israel for training missions. Native American activists in the United States have pointed out the similarities between the colonization and the expropriation of Palestinian land and what happened to the Native Americans. There's been an attempt to draw these things together that I think represents a real step forward and has scared Israel the most that it's been scared in decades. So Israel is passing laws making it illegal to advocate BDS, right? This kind of thing, talking about how it's a major threat to national security. The reason they're scared isn't, I think, at this point, because there's a tremendous economic threat to Israel. The kind of economic gains of BDS have been modest. We haven't managed to hit them in the pocketbook as hard as we need to yet. But what has really hurt them has been the PR gains. We have succeeded in delegitimizing Israel in the public sphere to an extent. Construction, or SodaStream, right, or any of the other companies that people know that are so closely linked to the occupation. And has succeeded in pushing the occupation into light that I think that support for Israel relies on keeping it out of. So I think that the BDS movement has been a tremendous step forward strategically for the Palestinian struggle, and has accomplished things that people would have thought impossible 2 decades ago. Where is it leading? I think so from 1967 on, when Israel began the official occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after the '67 war, the kind of leading international framework for discussing how to solve the conflict, how to solve, which is a euphemism in and of itself, was the two-state solution. That Israel would have a state, basically, the non-colored in area would be the Israeli state. And then there would be a Palestinian state here. Sometimes there were plans to connect it like that, so that it would be actually contiguous and not 2 small islands. But that was the framework in which people thought overwhelmingly that the conflict could be resolved, that justice could be brought to the region. And people who advocated this would sometimes acknowledge that the injustice actually started in 1948, and that Palestinians deserve the entire Palestinian homeland. And the PLO, for example, had a position in the early 70s of one secular democratic state for everyone who lives in historic Palestine. This was rejected by Israel, and by and large rejected by even supporters of Palestine in the United Nations. The framework was there'll be 2 states, 2 people, 2 states, this kind of framework. And this framework culminated in the peace process in Oslo, right? Oslo was supposed to be a process that would lead eventually to 2 states. Even as we've seen, it's actually gone in the opposite direction. Nowadays, the 2-state solution inspires very little optimism in anyone. So Netanyahu, the president of the prime minister of Israel, says there won't be a Palestinian state. He doesn't even pretend, right? For decades, Israeli politicians pretended that a Palestinian state would be in the works, not now, of course, but sometime down the future, there'd be a Palestinian state. Now Netanyahu has dispensed with that illusion, even. And I think the process of Oslo itself and the way colonization has proceeded has made it very clear that a 2-state solution is never going to happen. I mean, in my opinion, a 2-state solution was never going to bring justice. But if it would have been possible to have an actually sovereign Palestinian state, it would be better than nothing. It would be better than constant occupation. It's become overwhelmingly clear that even that is not a possibility. There is no possibility that Israel is ever going to allow a state of Palestinians, a democratic, sovereign state of Palestinians. And because of that, the 2-state solution has really faded. But I think reason for hope, again, is that the 1-state solution, which the PLO originally backed in the early 70s, has risen. So people like Ali Abunimah have written, I think really excellent books laying out the case for 1 state, which I think, when you think about it, is really the simplest solution. 1 state, everyone has equal democratic rights. It's a secular state, everyone can vote. These are the principles of democracy and human rights that are very basic. I mean, to me, it just represents how crazy the discourse around Israel is in the United States, that you're treated as an extremist for saying everyone should have equal rights, everyone should be able to vote, everyone should be treated equally under the law in historic Palestine. It's treated as not even worth considering, when really it's, I think, the obvious solution if you come to it without preconceptions. I mean, people say that Jewish Israelis would leave, that people would refuse to live there. I think it's very possible that a number would. In Algeria, when Algeria won independence from France, there was a substantial minority of French Algerian citizens called Pied Noirs who lived in Algeria, many of whom were born in Algeria. Many of them left. They decided they didn't want to have Algerian neighbors. If Jewish Israelis make that choice, that's up to them. If they leave, too bad. That's a condition of citizenship in a state, in a modern democratic state, is you have to live next to whoever wants to live next to you, right? And if Jewish Israelis decide that's not for them, well, that's too bad. And I think a number of Israelis have been voting with their feet in the last few years, leaving for Germany, leaving for other European states, leaving for the United States, getting 2 passports, because people see the handwriting on the wall, that Israel's legitimacy is waning, that support from the United States could be weakened through things like BDS, right? Already in Europe, in Europe, pension funds are already just divesting from Israel and from Israeli companies. I mean, if American pension funds started disinvesting, that could actually hurt the Israeli economy, right? And I think plenty of Israelis see that things aren't going their way. I think that's the long-term trend. And I think it's a reason to be very optimistic indeed. That doesn't foreclose on, of course, continued brutality from Israel towards the Palestinians. And indeed, as the Israelis lose power, I think we can expect them to actually lash out more and more in an attempt to hold on to it. And so the need for international solidarity is going to grow more, not less, as Israel is increasingly delegitimized. But I think it holds promise. Ultimately, I think for justice to be achieved in Palestine, it's going to have to come as part of a broader wave of democratization in the region. And we saw what that can look like in the Arab Spring, right, when dictators fell. I think that kind of unrest is going to be necessary to remake the Middle East and to finally wipe away the legacy of colonialism that's given us dictatorships across the region and settler states like Israel. But even if things aren't looking good for the Arab Spring now and for activists in places like Egypt or Syria, it's shown what can happen. And I think if activists, if ordinary people in those places are capable of standing up to the dictatorships, and if Palestinians in Israel are capable of waging the heroic fight that they've waged for decades now, it provides a glimpse of what's possible in that region. And it's the duty of, I think, moral people all over the entire world to support that fight. Thank you.